Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the latest episode of Adbi Exchange into the minds of four Pakistani authors. This project is supported by the US mission in Pakistan in collaboration with the Pakistan-U.S. Alumni Network. My name is Ayesha Fazlur Rahman. I'm a Fulbright alum from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, currently working in the education sector space and the development sector space. My colleague in this project is Alia Waqas, who's taking care of the technical aspect of the project, and she's an alum of the Iowa Writers Workshop. Our guest today is Shandana Minhas. I'm going to introduce her briefly before we start the discussion. Shandana Minhas is a Pakistani storyteller and the author of the novels Tunnel Vision, Survival Tips for Lunatics, which is the book that we are mainly going to be discussing today, Daddy's Boy, and the novella Rafina. Her first book was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Her second became the first children's book to win a general fiction prize in South Asia. Her essays, columns, and short fiction have appeared in publications including EPW, Herald, IQ, and the Griffith Review. Her work has been adapted for theater and cinema and translated into Italian and Estonian. She is an honorary fellow of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa and has a master's in creative writing from the University of East Anglia. Shandana was born in Karachi, currently lives in London, and is always threatening to write a memoir.
Hello.
Shandana, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Why are you threatening to write a memoir? Why is it a threat?
Oh, it should be a threat, right? If one has lived an interesting life, then revelations about it should threaten. But not to feel, zindagi boring ho jati.
Achha.
Yeah.
So there are revelations to be made about other people. Interesting.
Not just about other people. I think our entire culture and society is partly built on women's silence. So जब औरत कहती है कि मैं बता दूंगी सबको, तो फिर मुश्किल हो सकता है.
So everyone sort of wants to cover themselves up and hide somewhere कि हमारे बारे में ना हो.
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Shandana, I want to talk mainly about your book Survival Tips for Lunatics. So how did that happen? What was the inspiration? थोड़ा सा ये है कि when we're talking about literature and English, writing in English in Pakistan, there is literature for children, younger children, and there is literature for adults. And the space that you're working in, pre-teens, I think that there's a gap there. So were you conscious of that and addressing that, or how did that happen? Why that group?
Yes. I'm glad you asked this question. I think that I should begin by saying I don't believe in the idea of separate writing for children. I think that storytelling is storytelling. And I think there is such a thing as the invention of childhood, the idea that somehow children are different from, fully grown human beings. The children are people, they just happen to be small and growing. I actually don't operate in any distinct space. As a writer, I write stories. Who the story is for might differ, but I don't see the impulse coming from a different space. Survival Tips for Lunatics is actually the only one of my books that had a younger readership. And the reason it happened basically was I am a mother. I have 3 sons now. At that time, I had 2. And they would watch me, write or stare at walls. Ek zamane mein mera jo beech wala bachcha hai, I would be sitting at a table on my laptop, and he had this little toy laptop, and he'd bring his little table and chair, and he'd sit next to me, and he'd pretend to write all sorts. So koi kuch bole, to he'd say, "I'm writing." So it was really cute. And then as they got older, they started asking, "Why can't we read your books?" I said, "Because you find it very boring, right?" So then they started wondering, am I doing anything that's of any value? I mean, आप करती क्या हैं? हमें तो कोई evidence नहीं नजर आ रही कि आप किताबें लिखती हैं. I mean, so I wanted basically to communicate to my children that I had a story to tell them as well.
Okay.
So I think the reason Survival Tips worked so easily and it came to me so fluidly is because I knew exactly who I was writing for. I was writing for these 2 little boys that I knew intimately.
And it's also about 2 boys.
It's about 2 little boys, yes. Yeah.
Interesting. So I was wondering when I was looking through the books that you've written, and I thought Daddy's Boy is also has a male protagonist, as does this one. So that explains it, that you're kind of bringing in your own children.
Well, I think that Alana say that I'm bringing my own children into Daddy's Boy because that's a really, really big book. And I would definitely not advise anybody interested in children's literature to read their child Daddy's Boy. But I think that patriarchy and how patriarchy creates broken people is a recurring theme in my work. Yeah. That is why there tend to be more male protagonists, if you like, than female. But again, those are not conscious decisions. I mean, the calculus of writing does not involve sitting down beforehand and saying, "Isme main do aadmi dalungi, isme do औरतें डालूंगी."
बिल्कुल, absolutely.
Yeah.
अच्छा, उसमें एक और जो when we talk about children's literature, including survival tips, alienation and isolation, that theme is there. Even if you look at The Little Prince, Alice in Wonderland, even Harry Potter finds his own tribe, but initially he also starts off being isolated from the Muggle world that he's living in. So, do you feel this is a central theme in children's literature? And would you like to speak to that alienation, isolation? Why does that have that centrality in writing for young adults or young humans?
So I would argue actually that alienation and isolation is a recurring theme in all literature. It's a recurring theme in all storytelling. And it is also a recurring theme in our religious texts across all monotheistic religions and even polytheistic religions or atheism, the idea of being alone, alone in the universe, alone in a family, alone in a room. Alienation and isolation is a fundamental part of the human condition. And it is in a way the most difficult to deal with. So a lot of our stories tend to be about that because stories are basically how we learn to live in the world, right? So if you look at it from a biological imperative perspective, stories about isolation and alienation help explore and resolve situations in which someone might be outside the unit, right? And also how to deal with feeling alone, because that is an essential part of being alive, right? I don't know anybody who wakes up in the morning and feels connected. And in fact, all our searches are about that desire for connection. So I don't think that it's specific to children's literature. I think it's recurring in all literature. And I think it's a fundamental question of existence. And children are actually much closer to fundamental questions of existence than adults are. I think the older that we grow, the more confused we get by just the volume of the rhetoric around us, or हमें याद नहीं आता कि what actually matters to us. और अब तो और भी मुश्किल हो गया because there's constant stimulation, वो, etc., etc. A person can't hear themselves think.
So you're never really isolated in that sense. Like the
you're not allowed to.
Yes,
you're never allowed silence and space.
Which is something that you need.
Of course, yes, absolutely. Everybody needs space and silence.
So would you categorize your book Survival Tips as a fantasy fiction also, in some sense? Because we see Balochitherium, which is an extinct, obviously it's a dinosaur, so it's extinct, and other species. And would you classify it as that or not?
So I tend not to classify books. I feel that genre is an enemy. Genre was invented by marketeers, right? To differentiate between इस किताब का price point क्या होना चाहिए और उसको bookshelves पे कहाँ रखना चाहिए.
But it also helps consumers. It also helps consumers reach out for a certain book from the bookshelf, no?
Sure, but is that helping a reader? I mean, as a reader, isn't it better to pick up a book and discover something rather than decide, oh, this is what I want, and then have it? I mean, it's a different approach to reading, right? So I think that definitely Survival Tips for Lunatics, does it have fantastical elements? Sure, it has lots of elements. It's very political. It's slightly fantastical. It has, a strong theme of environmentalism and other stuff about human relationships. I kind of think it's one of those if I might use the term, genre bending books. I mean, ये है क्या, कहाँ से आई है? मुझे खुद नहीं समझ आई, but I had such a good time writing it. So.
Say that again. I missed that.
I had such a good time writing it. So it didn't really,
it
mattered to me that it was hard to place.
Yeah.
And I'm very lucky that I immediately found, someone who liked it as well. So
yeah. So that's my favorite part of the book, that it talks about Balochistan, and it talks about the wildlife there, because it really roots the story in the soil and yet makes it fantastical, but also roots it in the soil. And it presents Balochistan in a very different light. I don't know if that's what you meant when you said it's also political, but I think it does a very powerful statement, makes a very powerful statement that way.
Yeah, so I think, time is a strange thing, and time is not what we think it is. But I am going to use the word time to say, if we go back to that point in time in Pakistan, we were coming out of a very long spell of sustained horrific violence, which I think everybody's children obviously was horribly impacted by. So as a parent, I wanted to acknowledge the reality of violence in our lives. Though a lot of parents here prefer not to tell their children, कि बताने की ज़रूरत नहीं है, I mean, ठीक है, बच्चे पढ़ जाते हैं, etc., etc. And specifically, Balochistan is a blind spot in our national consciousness. And perceptions of Balochistan have been controlled. They have been inadequate in terms of communicating what life there is actually like. And I wanted my children not to grow up to be the sort of people who understand Balochistan simply as a brief bit of text in a geography book or a newspaper article, because all of those narratives are controlled, right? So how was I going to make the place real to them and appealing to them, and something that they wanted to see as being connected to them as Pakistanis, right? So then the question, yeah. So
also as an adult, I really felt that you've done it beautifully.
Yeah. Then it becomes a question of technique. What technique do you use? And the one that presented itself, I don't think this was conscious at the time, was a step away from realism. So realism is too close to journalism, quite frankly.
Right.
And but realism for at that particular point in time was kind of dominant in the technique a lot of Pakistan writers were using, and some of them still are, right? Gritty realism to depict violence, etc., etc. So that would not work for a younger audience. So it was a natural move away from gritty realism and towards a place where you create that space for your imagination to work. I think that's when the fantastical elements came in. So you got to rip out what you want to do from the realism and you got to put it somewhere else. Yeah.
So Shandana,
did that answer your question? I forgot the question.
It does. No, it does. It definitely does.